Hello everyone and welcome to Disclosures of the Third Kind. This will be episode 1 of Disclosures of the Third Kind. In this episode I will be looking at the Arroyo photograph, which is a supposed photograph of the craft that crashed at Roswell. But without further ado, let's move in to the episode. In 1947, something crashed in the New Mexico desert. Officially it was a weather balloon, but scattered across the historical record are strange photographs, unusual materials, and witness accounts that suggest the story might not be that simple. One of the most curious images is known as the Arroyo photograph. My name is Christian Stefanizzi. In January of this year, I released a book called Beyond Roswell, Cold War Cover-Ups and Conspiracy Theories. And I'm now releasing, in May, a book called The Undisclosed Visitors, which I'm currently working on, looking at the disclosure movement and historical cases, as when this all comes out, history will have to be changed. On this channel I examine the historical record behind the UFO phenomena, declassified documents, witness testimony, and the cases that have remained unexplained for decades. Today I want to begin with something intriguing, the so-called Arroyo photograph. Now, this isn't a new image. In fact, it has been circulating for quite some time, actually. Some researchers believe it appeared in connection with the 1995 Air Force report, the Roswell report, fact versus fiction in the New Mexico desert. However, upon speaking to professionals, authors such as Kevin Randall, nobody knows its origin, and to this date I haven't found its origin. The photograph supposedly shows debris or an object recovered in an arroyo, a dry creek bed somewhere in the region of the Roswell debris field. What makes the photograph interesting is not that it proves anything outright, it doesn't at all, but what it does show is an unusual shape, something that at first glance doesn't clearly resemble a balloon array or conventional debris. Over the years, many images have circulated online claiming to show Roswell debris. In most cases, researchers have eventually traced these photographs back to ordinary sources. Weather balloons, aircraft parts, or unrelated military equipment. That's why images like this must be treated very carefully. However, the Arroyo photograph raises a very important question. Some observers have noted that the outline of the object appears somewhat similar to descriptions given by certain Roswell witnesses in later years, and in fact I outlined that in my last book, Beyond Roswell, Cold War Cover-Ups and Conspiracy Theories. It's very closely similar to the NASA 1960 NASA space taxi idea that they put forward, which is very interesting, but we'll come back to that later. Some depictions suggested that recovered craft may not have been a perfect disc at all, but something more unusual, sometimes described as slightly crescent-shaped or heel-shaped. However, this is where the historical record becomes complicated, to say the least. I recently contacted Roswell researcher Kevin D. Randall, who wrote the book in 1994, The Truth About the Roswell UFO Crash at Roswell. Kevin explained that the sketches of that type of craft were produced in the early 1990s, after claims made by Frank Kaufman, who later proved to be an unreliable source. In fact, those sketches may have even been influenced by imagery that appeared in Popular Mechanics at the time. Kevin also mentioned that during his own research, through Air Force documentation, he never found a photograph that clearly matched the Arroyo image. That means its origin remains uncertain, as I stated before. And that, in itself, is the most revealing part. Because one of the recurring challenges when studying the Roswell case is that many pieces of evidence appear decades later, often without clear documentation of where they came from. So what are we looking at in the Arroyo photograph? Could be nothing more than misidentified debris. That's entirely possible, but it could also be one of many images that have been detached from their original context over the decades. The important point is this: the Roswell case is full of fragments like this: photographs, testimonies, documents, pieces that don't always fit neatly together. My goal in the Undisclosed Visitors is not to simply repeat the Roswell story, but to examine the wider historical record surrounding these early UFO encounters. When you look at the documents from Project Sign, Grudge and Project Blue Book, you begin to see a pattern: repeated sightings, repeated investigations, and repeated conclusions that the phenomena could not be easily explained. Whether this Arroyo photograph is meaningful or not remains an open question. Another detail that makes this photograph extremely interesting is the structure visible underneath the object, which in the Frank Kaufman depiction is obviously more visible than it is in the photograph. When you compare it to some of the sketches that have circulated over the years, including those attributed to witness testimony collected by Don Schmidt and others, you begin to notice something unusual. Some of these depictions show what appears to be a honeycomb-like structure beneath the aircraft. Now remember this, because this is important. It's important because a researcher named Art Campbell, whose work on the UFO crash at the Plains of San Agustin uncovered material recovered from the Plains of San Agustin site, alleged by many witnesses at the time to have been the crash site. He reported collecting in 2013 a very unusual composition, a honeycomb-like structure unlike conventional materials. Campbell reported that isotopic testing suggested the material did not match normal terrestrial manufacturing processes. When you place that alongside some of the early witness descriptions, the similarity becomes difficult to ignore. Now, this brings us to a controversial figure in the Roswell story, Frank Kaufman. Many researchers, such as Kevin Randall, today consider Kaufman unreliable, and there are certainly good reasons to be cautious about his testimony, but the historical record is rarely simple, because occasionally even unreliable witnesses can still contain fragments of truth mixed with their accounts. And when you look at the structural details in some of these sketches, the unusual profile of the craft and the suggestion of a honeycomb-like underside, you have to at least consider the possibility that Kaufman may have been right about some points, even if he embellished other parts of his story. This is why images like the Arroyo photograph continue to attract attention, because even decades later we still don't know exactly where the photograph originated. And believe me, through my research I am fighting to find out, but to this date I have not. Officials have never clearly commented on it, and the object visible in the Arroyo remains identified. And so, this case can firmly sit in the unexplainable. I'm Christian Stefanizzi, and this is Disclosures of the Third Kind.